In Seattle, power never wore a face anyone expected. It moved in armored cars, in silenced guns, in men who answered to a name whispered like weather no one dared question. Nobody in that world ever imagined an empire built on blood money could be brought to its knees by a woman checking risk files in a back office. A woman most people in that building couldn't have named if asked. Claire Lawson was 27, curvy, quiet, and by every measure the room around her used invisible. That invisibility was about to become the single most dangerous miscalculation the Hamilton family's enemies would ever make. Because the moment Zachary Hamilton finally noticed her, nothing in Seattle would ever go back to the way it was. Rain fell in a thin, cold mist over Seattle, catching the gold light spilling from the tall windows of an art auction house in South Lake Union. The light was warm. It did not reach the corner where she stood. Claire Lawson, 27 years old, curvy and full-figured, wore an oversized dark cardigan and kept her chestnut hair pulled low against her neck. She had learned over many years alone exactly how much space a room would allow her to take up, and she never took more than that. No parents to call, no siblings to sit beside, just a small apartment in Capitol Hill and a low-level job checking risk files for Pinnacle Harbor Group. A job she'd been sent to cover tonight because no one else wanted the assignment. A wealthy partner glanced her up and down, then turned to Jessica Collins and said it loud enough for the whole table to hear. "Is your company lowering the bar on guests these days? I don't want to sit next to something that thins out the air." Jessica laughed, sharp and pleased, and dragged her chair another half-foot away. The table turned to look. Someone chuckled softly. Jessica walked to the microphone a moment later, her voice sweet as poison. "Perhaps we should save the seats for people who fit a little better." The room laughed. Claire kept her eyes on the floor and her spine straight. She had trained herself long ago not to let a room see her flinch. None of them knew it yet, but that laugh was the last free one this room would ever get at her expense. Every person mocking her tonight had just made themselves a name on a list they didn't know existed, and the man who would come to collect on it was already circling closer than anyone in that ballroom could guess. 20 minutes later, reaching for a glass of water, she felt a full glass of red wine tip accidentally down the front of her blouse. "Oh, sorry," Jessica said, smiling. "Though I don't think the stain shows more than the shape underneath it." The tables around them glanced over, then looked away. No one offered a napkin. Claire didn't wait for an apology that would never come. She slipped toward the storage room behind the gallery, using the excuse of checking a shipment of paintings marked "missing" as part of her assignment. In a drawer stuffed with dusty paperwork, she found a shipping invoice for a private yacht from Canada, the listed amount 10 times higher than any real market value. The receiving account belonged to a shell company under the Hamilton name. Her heart slammed against her ribs. She photographed the invoice, her hands trembling but her fingers fast and precise, the same instinct that made her good at spotting discrepancies no one else noticed. At that exact moment, an elderly woman stumbled near the storage door. No one moved to help her. Claire was there in an instant, catching her before she fell. The old woman, Grace Hamilton, gripped Claire's wrist with startling strength. "Hold on to it," she whispered, barely audible. Before an event staffer arrived, she pressed an embroidered handkerchief stitched with red roses into the pocket of Claire's coat. Claire went home to her small apartment. She locked the door, leaned against it for a long moment, and only then unfolded the handkerchief under the weak light of her desk lamp. The stitching wasn't decoration. Hidden in the careful threadwork was a string of numbers, disguised inside the pattern of roses laid out with a precision that looked almost engineered rather than sewn. As she shook the handkerchief gently, an old Polaroid slipped free. In the photograph, a 12-year-old girl was being carried by a young man of about 19 beside a stretch of water that looked like Lake Washington. On the back, in faded handwriting, 2 words: "Keep her." Claire didn't recognize herself in the photo. The light was poor. The girl's face turned half away, and 15 years change a child's features more than anyone likes to admit. But a cold feeling crept up her spine that she couldn't explain. She sat in the dark for a long time, her fingers tracing the numbers, her eyes locked on those 2 words. Keep her. Nothing about the night connected. Not the account numbers, not the photograph, not the old woman's grip on her wrist. And yet all 3 had arrived in the same few hours, and none of them felt like coincidence. People only ever saw her body. They never saw what she had just tucked into her coat pocket, or what was staring back at her from an old photograph she didn't remember being in. 2 days later, the air at Pinnacle Harbor Group's South Lake Union office turned unnaturally heavy. 4 men in black suits stepped out of a private elevator, moving in unison, silent. Behind them came Zachary Hamilton, 34 years old, 6'2", the tattoo of a serpent coiled around an hourglass visible on his left forearm as he rolled up his sleeve. Seattle knew the name Hamilton the way it knew weather patterns, something you didn't question, only prepared for. He was the Mafia boss half the city pretended not to fear. Thomas Reynolds went pale, nearly falling out of his chair at the sight of him. He pointed straight at Claire. "She's the one who processed the file. If there's an error, it's hers." Claire's own supervisor, a woman who had barely spoken 2 words to her in a year, stepped forward without being asked and added coldly, "She's new, inexperienced. I'd trust the numbers over her judgment." It was a smaller cruelty than the auction house. No crowd, no laughter, but it stung differently, because it came from someone who was supposed to have her back. Claire's pulse hammered in her ears, loud enough to drown out the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. Her hands folded tightly in her lap had gone cold despite the warmth of the room. She noticed absurdly the small tremor in her own knuckles, the same tremor she'd trained herself to hide at every table that had ever laughed at her. This time she didn't let it win. She uncurled her fingers, flattened her palms against her thighs, and breathed once slow through her nose. Claire didn't flinch. She walked into the glass conference room. Her voice shook, but every word landed clean. "There is no error. The money was routed to a different account." Zachary looked at her for the first time. It wasn't contempt. It wasn't pity. It was the look of a man recognizing at last the thing he had been hunting. Something flickered behind his eyes, quick, involuntary, gone, almost before it registered, the way a man's face moves when a name he hasn't said aloud in 15 years suddenly has a face to match it. He said nothing about it. He only studied her a half-second longer than the room around them would have found comfortable. He crossed the room, seized Thomas Reynolds by the collar, and pressed him back against the glass wall, hard enough to make the pain shudder. His voice dropped low and cold. "Don't ever interrupt her in front of me again." The room went silent. Thomas slid into his chair, breathing hard. Zachary turned back to Claire, his voice quieter now. "Do you have proof?" She nodded. He reached out and brushed a loose strand of hair from her forehead, slow, deliberate, like a gesture he'd rehearsed 100 times in his mind and never once allowed himself. His hand paused a moment too long near her temple. And for that moment, the room, the suits, the tension, all of it seemed to fall away from his face. Claire felt her breath catch. Not from fear this time, but from the strange, unfamiliar sensation of being looked at, like she was worth memorizing. In the hallway, Samuel Baker stared at Claire's face a moment too long, then murmured to Zachary just loud enough for her to catch. "Boss, it's really her. The photograph your grandmother kept, it's still in the safe." Zachary said nothing. He only tightened his hold on Claire's hand by one more degree. She was escorted to an armored car, her hand still clenched around the bag hiding the handkerchief and the photograph. Inside the car, the city blurred past in streaks of gray rain and red taillights. Claire pressed her palm flat against the cold window, trying to slow her own heartbeat by counting the passing streetlights, the way she used to count columns in a ledger, a habit from childhood she'd never told anyone about, a way of making an unmanageable world feel briefly countable. Across from her, Zachary watched her do it, and something in his expression softened, as if the gesture confirmed a suspicion he'd been carrying since the moment Samuel spoke her name in the hallway. He didn't ask what she was counting. He only reached over without a word and laid his coat across her shoulders against the chill from the cracked window. The first small kindness anyone in that building had offered her all year. Whatever Samuel meant by a photograph kept for 15 years, whatever Zachary's silence was covering, one thing was certain. His eyes had never belonged to someone meeting her for the first time. He looked at her like a man who had just found something he'd been searching for, and like a man staring at a debt that had waited 15 years to come due. Claire's own supervisor sided against her before a single fact was checked. No crowd forced her hand, no threat was made. Was that woman protecting the company or protecting herself? Answer in one word in the comments. Coward or survivor, and tell us which one you'd have been in that room. Claire ran home to her apartment the moment she got the chance. She locked the door, chained it, drew the curtains, and slid down against the wood, breathing hard. The apartment was too quiet in the way it always was. No roommate's footsteps overhead, no voice calling her name from another room. But tonight the silence felt different, thinner, like something waiting just behind it. She caught herself glancing at the deadbolt twice, then a third time, some old animal instinct telling her the lock wouldn't matter tonight, the way it always had before. Late that night, her door gave way with a sudden splintering crack. Two strangers came through with silenced weapons raised. One of them smiled cold and certain. "Reynolds is paying good money to make you disappear clean." Claire backed into the corner, gripping a heavy brass lamp, her last line of defense. Then the bedroom window shattered from the outside. Zachary Hamilton came through it with two of his men behind him. His shots were fast, controlled, and final. The threat ended before it ever reached her. In the sudden quiet, Claire's mind moved before her fear could catch up. She'd spent years trained to notice what didn't add up in a ledger, and instinct sent her straight to the phone lying near her feet. She unlocked it and found a saved voicemail still queued from earlier that evening. She pressed play. Thomas Reynolds' voice came through flat and businesslike. "Clean it up. No trace of that girl left anywhere. I don't want Hamilton finding out she ever touched the books." Claire copied the file to her own phone and slipped the recording into her coat before Zachary lifted her off the ground. He carried her like she weighed nothing, his voice rough. "They almost took the one thing I've ever wanted to keep." Claire's hands, still trembling from adrenaline, curled instinctively into the fabric of his shirt, and she felt his heartbeat hammering just as hard as her own beneath it, proof, however small, that whatever composure the Hamilton name wore in public, it hadn't reached this room tonight. On the way to the car, he leaned close, his voice low enough for only her to hear. "I've been looking for you for 15 years, since the night a car went into Lake Washington." Claire went still. The night her parents died, in an accident she'd been 12, and there had been a young man who carried her out of the water and to the hospital, then vanished before anyone thought to ask his name. For 15 years, this Mafia boss had built an empire on the one skill that never failed him: control. But the night he pulled a child from Lake Washington was the 1 hour of his life he couldn't control, and he had never forgiven himself for losing track of her afterward. His obsession with Claire was never only desire, it was the guilt of a 19-year-old boy who had saved a life and then let it slip through his fingers, finally given a second chance to hold on properly. The car sped toward Bellevue. The Hamilton estate rose out of the pine trees like a fortress lit from within. Grace Hamilton was already standing in the entryway when they arrived. She saw Claire and burst into tears, taking both her hands, her voice trembling.
The handkerchief. It's finally where it belongs.
The recording from Reynolds's phone was still tucked in Claire's coat. Zachary had just said he'd searched for her for 15 years, and an old woman was crying over a scrap of embroidered cloth, as though it were the answer to a prayer she'd almost given up on. Claire wasn't an outsider anymore. She was a debt the Hamilton family had never repaid, and now she was holding the very evidence that could end the man who'd tried to erase her. Samuel Baker led Claire down to the command level beneath the Bellevue estate, telling her it was for her own safety. The steel door sealed behind them with a heavy electronic click that seemed to swallow the sound of her own breathing. The air below was cold, humming faintly with rows of servers and dim monitors. A faint blue glow washed over the concrete walls. Somewhere in the ductwork, a fan cycled on and off, like something breathing in its sleep. Claire noticed, without knowing why she noticed it, that Samuel's hand trembled on the stair rail. He wasn't a man built for stairs that shook him. He was ex-military, steady as a table. She'd seen him carry 2 crates of files up 4 flights without breaking stride. But tonight, his knuckles were white around the railing, and twice he stopped as if listening for something only he could hear. "You've worked for the family a long time," she said, mostly to fill the silence, mostly because the silence had teeth. 20 years. His voice came out flat, rehearsed, the way people speak when they've already decided how the sentence is going to end, no matter what she says next. "Since before Zachary took the name." "Then you knew Grace when she was young enough to run this place herself?" Something crossed his face, not quite a smile, more like the ghost of one gone before it could land. "She used to say the same thing you just did. That people forget the ones who built the walls and only remember the ones who live inside them." Samuel's phone buzzed on the way down the last flight of stairs. Claire caught the message lit on the lock screen before he could turn it away. "The girl from the lake is back. Handle it before the boss learns everything. Your daughter's medical bills stop being covered in 48 hours. Don't forget you were driving that night too." Samuel silenced the phone, but Claire had already read every word, and something in her chest went very still and very cold, the way it had the night she found the invoice in the storage room. That same sensation of a floor she'd trusted quietly giving way beneath her. He didn't raise the gun right away. That was the part that would stay with her longest. Not the weapon, but the hesitation before it. The way his hand hovered near his hip like it belonged to someone else. "You don't want to do this," Claire said quietly. "No," Samuel agreed. "I don't." And then he drew it anyway, his voice caught between grief and resolve. "My daughter will die if I don't hand you over." He hadn't turned on the family for money alone. 15 years ago, he'd been behind the wheel of another car on that stretch of road, and he'd driven away instead of stopping a decision Reynolds had quietly documented and held over him ever since, covering just enough of his daughter's care to keep him obedient. It wasn't loyalty that kept him in Reynolds' pocket. It was arithmetic, a father doing the only math that had ever mattered to him over and over for 15 years, and always coming up short. "She's 7, Samuel said, almost to himself, the gun steady now, even as his voice wasn't. "She doesn't know why Daddy works so many nights. She just knows I always come home." Samuel wasn't a man who woke up one day and chose betrayal. He was a man who had made one cowardly choice 15 years earlier and had been paying for it in small, silent installments ever since. His loyalty to the Hamiltons was real, but it had always come second to the one thing he could never undo: the sound of tires pulling away from a lake he should have stopped at. Reynolds hadn't created his weakness, he'd simply found it and priced it the way a man prices anything he intends to own for a long time. The wall behind them exploded inward in a sheet of concrete dust and orange light. Zachary Hamilton came through it like a storm given a name, gun already raised. his eyes finding Claire first, checking in the half-second it took him to cross the threshold, whether she was standing, whether she was breathing, whether she was his, to still be angry for. Samuel turned his weapon on Zachary. There was no way back now, and something in his shoulders seemed almost to loosen at that, the relief of a decision finally out of his hands. Claire didn't run. Her mind did what it had always done under pressure, the same instinct that had once made her the only person in the building who noticed a decimal point out of place. It narrowed the room down to numbers. She lunged for the central control panel, her hands shaking but moving fast, entering the sequence hidden in the handkerchief's stitching. Her fingers found the pattern the moment they touched the keys, the same layered encoding she reconciled in corporate ledgers every day. Except this one wasn't a bank account at all. It was a cipher, built decades ago by Grace herself, as a failsafe only family blood was ever meant to hold. For one terrible second, the screen blinked red, rejecting the sequence, and Claire's stomach dropped, until she realized she'd read the fourth rows backward, the thread doubling back on itself, the way real embroidery does when a hand gets tired. She corrected it. The screen turned green. Within seconds, the estate's entire weapons network locked down, cutting off every gun on the attacking side with a series of soft mechanical clicks that echoed down the corridor like a held breath finally released. Zachary looked at Claire for just 1 second, stunned and fiercely proud, the look of a man watching someone solve in 10 seconds what it had taken his grandmother a lifetime to build, before turning back to Samuel and ending the threat with 3 precise final shots. Samuel went down without a sound. For a moment, nobody moved. The hum of the servers filled the silence where a man had just been standing. Zachary didn't look at him again. He crossed to Claire and pulled her into an embrace so tight she nearly lost her breath, one hand pressed flat against the back of her head, like he was making sure it was still attached to the rest of her. His voice came out low and rough, like a vow. "No one touches what belongs to me, not even my own blood." Claire's hands were still shaking against his chest. She didn't look at Samuel's body. She made herself not look because some part of her, the part that still did the arithmetic even now, understood that he had been a father before he had ever been an enemy, and that Reynolds' name belonged on that debt more than his did. In that one instant, this Mafia boss chose a woman he'd known for days over a man who had guarded his back for 20 years, not out of cruelty, but because Claire represented the one loyalty he'd never had to question. For a man who trusted almost no one, her steady hands on that keypad were proof of something rarer than devotion. She had chosen to fight for his world before he'd even asked her to belong to it. The message on Samuel's phone you were driving that night too was still there when it was over. Claire had just saved an entire empire with a strip of embroidered cloth, and had also just watched the man she loved end the life of someone who'd once been closest to him. She had saved an empire with a handkerchief. But who had planned to erase her long before she ever set foot in that estate, and who else had been on that road the night everything changed? Upstairs, hours later, the estate had gone quiet in the particular way houses go quiet after violence, too clean, too still, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Grace had ordered every light in the east wing turned off, except one, the lamp in the small sitting room where she used to read to Zachary as a boy. Claire sat wrapped in a blanket that wasn't hers, staring at a cup of tea she hadn't touched. Zachary sat across from her, elbows on his knees, hands still faintly dusted with concrete from the wall he'd torn through to reach her. "You're thinking about him," Zachary said, not a question. "He had a daughter." Claire's voice was small, in a way it hadn't been since the auction house. 7 years old. "I know." Zachary's jaw tightened. "I'll see that she's cared for, properly, without Reynolds' name anywhere near it." Claire looked up at that, really looked at him the way she hadn't quite let herself before, past the tattoo and the reputation and the 4 men in black suits. "That's not what I expected you to say." People expect me to be the thing they've heard about." His voice was quiet now, stripped of the command it carried downstairs. "I've spent 15 years being exactly that, so no one would look closely enough to see the part of me that never stopped looking for a girl who went into a lake and never should have had to climb back out alone." It was the first time he'd said it plainly, without the armor of, "I've been looking for you," delivered like an order. Claire didn't answer right away. She only reached across the small space between them and laid her hand over his, over the knuckles still faintly gray with dust, and let the silence do what neither of them had words for yet. A week passed. A charity gala filled the ballroom of the Fairmont Olympic Hotel in downtown Seattle. Chandeliers glittered above rows of wine glasses, a string quartet threading something slow and formal beneath the murmur of 100 conversations, and the room was crowded with Seattle's wealthiest families, politicians, and business leaders. The same species of room that had once laughed at her from a corner table. Claire noticed it the moment she stepped through the doors, the particular quality of attention a room gives someone it has decided in advance to judge. She felt her spine want to curve inward, the old habit of taking up less space than she was owed. Zachary's hand found the small of her back before she could fold into it. "Stand the way you stood in that conference room," he said quietly, close to her ear. "The rest of the room will follow your lead. It always does." Zachary Hamilton walked Claire into the center of the ballroom. She wore a fitted black gown that followed every curve she had spent years trying to hide. The entire room turned to look. This time, no one laughed. Someone near the bar actually lowered a glass mid-sip, as though the sight had physically interrupted them. He stopped her in the middle of the floor, lifted her hand, and slid a large black diamond onto her ring finger. The quartet, on some silent cue from the event staff, let their song trail off into nothing so that his voice carried clearly through the room, calm and absolute. "No one in this room will ever speak to her the way some of you once did. That chapter is closed. Permanently." Seattle's Mafia boss had never once raised his voice to make a point land he didn't need to. He said it the way other men announce a merger, and the room understood it exactly that way. Jessica Collins stood frozen in the crowd near the far column, her champagne glass tilting dangerously in her hand, her face drained of color as she backed up until her shoulders hit the wall. No one laughed, no one whispered. Only silence and the small, unmistakable sound of her glass finally slipping and shattering against the marble floor. Thomas Reynolds was brought onto the stage by two of Zachary's men, shaking so badly he could barely stand, his tie already loosened by someone else's hands, not his own. Instead of letting him read a prepared apology, Zachary gave the smallest signal, 2 fingers barely lifted. Claire stepped up to the microphone and set a phone down beside it, her hand steadier than she expected it to be. Reynolds' own voice played out across the ballroom, tinny and small through the speaker, but unmistakable. "Clean it up. No trace of that girl left anywhere. I don't want Hamilton finding out she ever touched the books." The room froze. Somewhere behind Claire, a woman gasped audibly. Reynolds was led away moments later, his shoes scraping against the floor as if his legs had simply stopped agreeing to carry him. No one saw him again. While the crowd still murmured, Zachary handed Claire a thin envelope. Inside was a copy of a transfer contract, money moving from a rival family's shell company, the Morettis, directly into Jessica Collins's personal account, dated the exact day Claire had been humiliated at the auction house. Jessica hadn't hated her only for her body. She had been paid to make Claire an easy target, a distraction dressed up as cruelty, so that no one at that table would look too closely at a storage room full of misfiled invoices. Claire almost felt something close to pity as she watched Jessica's manicured hand press flat against the wall behind her, as if the marble itself might hold her up, now that the room no longer would. That night, On the rooftop terrace overlooking Lake Washington, the city's lights scattered gold across the black water, and the wind carried up the faint sound of the quartet still playing 3 floors below. Claire stood at the railing, the diamond on her hand catching the light every time she moved. She turned to Zachary and said, low but steady, "I don't want to be hidden anymore." He leaned down close enough that she could feel the warmth of him against the cold coming off the water. This time, Claire kissed him first. It wasn't acceptance anymore. It was a declaration. The contract exposing Jessica and the recording that had ended Reynolds' standing in front of all of Seattle's elite both still lingered in the air of that ballroom 3 floors below them, already becoming the story the whole city would be telling by morning. From that night on, Seattle would know the name Claire Lawson, and it would know exactly who had once been paid to turn her into a joke right before she used their own evidence to end them. The next morning, soft light filtered through the heavy silk curtains of the master bedroom overlooking Lake Washington, laying pale gold stripes across the sheets. Claire woke slowly in the wide bed, the kind of waking that comes without a jolt, without a reason to brace for the day. Zachary sat beside her, already awake, the serpent tattoo visible on his forearm as he took her hand. He turned it over slowly, studying the back of it, the way a man studies something he still can't quite believe is real. He pressed his lips to old, faded marks there, small, pale lines she'd carried since childhood, marks she'd never once had to explain to anyone, because no one had ever looked closely enough to ask, and said low and certain, "These are mine to protect now. No one leaves another one on you." Even a Mafia boss, it turned out, could learn to speak in a voice meant only for healing. "You've been looking for these marks for 15 years, she said quietly, "since before you even knew my name." "I didn't need your name." His thumb traced the edge of her palm. "I only ever needed to know you were still somewhere in the world, still breathing. The rest, I would have waited for." The bedroom door opened quietly. Grace Hamilton stepped in, still in her robe, carrying a worn leather photo album pressed against her chest, like something she'd been guarding for a very long time. She set it on the bed between them, her hands lingering on the cover a moment longer than necessary. "I almost brought this to you 100 times, Grace admitted, her voice unsteady in a way Claire hadn't heard from her yet. "And 100 times I told myself the timing wasn't right. I think I was afraid that if I showed you too soon, you'd run from all of it. From him, from this house, from a debt you never asked to be part of." Inside was the familiar Polaroid, a 12-year-old girl carried out of Lake Washington by a 19-year-old boy, Zachary, soaked to the shoulders, his face caught mid-shout in the old photograph, calling for help that hadn't yet arrived. Beneath the photo, in the same faded hand, the debt of the Hamilton family. Between 2 pages lay a thin yellowed letter and a notarized document dated exactly 15 years earlier. Grace had written, "If you ever came back, I wanted you to know the truth before anyone else could tell it to you. You are the reason my grandson survived that night, and you have been named formally and legally as a full heir of the Hamilton family, not a substitute, not a backup plan, but family in every sense that matters. You were never just his obsession. You were always meant to be one of us." Claire's eyes stung as she read it a second time, then a third, her thumb resting over the ink as if she could feel the 15 years behind it. "Why didn't you ever come find me yourself? You had the resources, you had his," she gestured faintly at Zachary, "his whole reach." "Because grief makes cowards of even strong women," Grace said simply. "After the accident, I told myself finding you would only reopen a wound none of us knew how to close. It was easier to keep the handkerchief in a drawer than to risk knocking on a stranger's door and being told I was wrong about who you'd become. I regret every one of those years now, but I don't regret that the wait ended exactly here in this house with you already wearing his ring." Claire looked up. Grace only smiled, her voice light as wind. "I've waited a long time for that letter to be read, and now all of Seattle will know it too." Claire turned to Zachary. He looked back at her, and for once there was nothing guarded in his face, none of the stillness he wore like armor in every boardroom and every ballroom. Neither of them needed another word. She had never been an outsider. She was the reason he had survived that night, and she was at last exactly where she had always belonged. They once called her the girl no one wanted. Now Seattle knew her as the woman who stood beside the Hamilton name and understood that from the very beginning she had never been on the outside looking in. This story reminds us that the cruelest verdicts about our worth are almost always handed down by people who never had to live inside our skin, and their opinion was never a fact, only a habit they mistook for one. If you've spent years shrinking yourself to fit someone else's comfort, at 65 or 75, it isn't too late to take up the space you were always allowed to take. Pick one room in your life, a church committee, a bridge club, a family dinner table where you've quietly been editing yourself, and this week, say the thing you'd normally swallow. If you've lost a spouse, and gatherings feel like they were built for 2 chairs instead of 1, ask a neighbor to save you a seat before the room fills up, instead of waiting to be noticed. Small requests build new belonging faster than patience ever will. Keep a running list, real or in your head, of the apologies and thank yous you're still owed, and let yourself ask for just one of them this year. Dignity was never about being seen by everyone in the room. It was about refusing to disappear from your own life. What part of Claire's story hit closest to home for you? The humiliation, the recognition, or the moment she finally stopped hiding? Tell us in the comments. And if her transformation moved you, like, share, and subscribe for the next story.